Well, brethren, we are moving very rapidly toward the spring festival season. We're in that time that we often call the pre-Passover period, the pre-Passover season. It seems like for those of us who have been in the church for a number of years, that often that period of time prior to the Passover has been a time of many trials and difficulties. It seems like that often happens from year to year. And we are certainly going through, I know that many of you have been, and many of God's people have been struggling with a lot of different trials, maybe job problems, and I know several of you have been in situations where just been in a real difficult circumstance in terms of job problems. Some of you have been dealing with some real serious health problems and been struggling and battling with ongoing health problems. You know, I'm not talking about something that's just sort of here and there, here and quickly gone, but just the pressures and the things that build up with something that hangs on and on and on and on. It may be health problems, may be job and financial problems, may be various other things, in some cases certain family difficulties and pressures that certain of you have been going through and have been facing. And one of the things that comes through, and I think one of the things that I have seen increasingly in recent times, is the extent to which many of God's people are having to battle with depression and discouragement. These are things that can be very real. And I want us to go through and to focus on some things today that I think can help us to understand some things about discouragement and depression, and to focus in on some keys that we're given in the Scriptures in terms of dealing with it. Because God has called us to conquer. He's called us to overcome. He's called us to go forward. He has called us to inherit and possess a kingdom. And yet, so often, there are things that there are obstacles that get in our way, and when we get depressed, when we get discouraged, when we're down, we don't feel like going forward. You know, God called Israel of old to go forward, to come into possession of a land, to come into possession of a kingdom. And He brought them out of a very difficult circumstance. And Israel's situation, Israel's experience, serves to illustrate some vital lessons for us. The Apostle Paul tells us in the New Testament that the things that happened to Israel of old happened by way of examples for us. They are things that happen that illustrate the proclivities and the tendencies of human nature. They establish patterns of the way that often things happen when God has called a people and is working with them. So, as we go back, I want to call our attention just briefly to some events here recounted in the book of Exodus. Now, in Exodus chapter 14, we find the story. You see, if you go on back to Exodus chapter 12, here Moses is announcing about the Passover, and the children of Israel are prepared after several generations in Egypt, the last period of time, the last decades of their period of time there having been a time of grinding slavery and oppression. Something that they were crying out to God by reason of their bondage. They were miserable. They were unhappy. They were deeply bothered, and they were in a situation from which they couldn't deliver themselves. So God provided a deliverer. He provided Moses to come and to bring them out. And you remember the ups and downs that they went through. Finally, they're ready to come out. They come, and they begin to come out of Egypt. And we're told that in Exodus 14 and verse 8, that in the latter part of verse 8 of Exodus 14, we're told, and the children of Israel went out with a high hand. Boy, they were excited. They were on a high. They went out with a high hand. They had seen the miracles of God and the deliverance that He had provided for them. Well, they came down And very quickly, they confronted an obstacle. And it was like all of their excitement, they went from it was like being on a roller coaster. They went from the height right down to the depth. Boy, they were all excited, and they were, you can just imagine, they were talking and they were laughing and they were just, everybody was telling his story of what had happened the night before, and here they were going on and they were talking and all this excitement. And somebody said, "What's that dust cloud back there?" "Oh, I don't know." And they were going on, weren't paying any attention to it, and somebody said, "You know what, that looks like an army coming back there. I mean, there is a dust cloud just covering the horizon. That's not a couple of camels out there. That's an army." And word began to buzz, and back of the line to front of the line, word was passing back and forth. Pretty soon, somebody said, "That's Pharaoh. The Egyptian army. They're coming after us." Oh, boy. From the height right on down to the depth, here was the Red Sea in front of them. We're caught. We're surrounded. We're going to die. Oh, no. And here they were. Well, God worked a miracle. And He brought them across the Red Sea. They held up there that evening, and God sent a wind, and it divided the sea, and it dried the seabed, and they began to walk across. Boy, you talk about excitement. They came out on the other side, and then when the Egyptian army came in, the sea came back together and closed up, and no more Egyptian army. Now, wouldn't you think something like that? Boy, if you could see a miracle like that, you would never be discouraged again. Never question, never doubt, right? Don't kid yourself. Human nature does not long retain, is impressed with a miracle for a very short time. Well, it can be impressed for, a little while, but usually not for very long. Reminds me of many years ago when I was when I was in South Texas, serving down in Corpus Christi, and I got a phone call one afternoon. I was up there in Corpus and got a phone call from a young man down in the valley, Rio Grande Valley, which is right on the Mexican border, about 150 miles south of Corpus. And he called, and he was very concerned and distraught. His little daughter, who was about 2 years old, was stricken with appendicitis, and he was very, very, very concerned about her and her. His wife was not in the church, and a number of her relatives, they were all very strong Catholic, Mexican Catholics, and he had not been in the church for all that long, and he called, and he was very concerned and concerned about his little daughter, and they were there. They were all sort of around, and they didn't want him to take time to call or to anything, and so we talked on the phone, and I said, "Well, look." We discussed about things, and so I said, "Well, look," I said, "we're 150 miles apart." I said, "There's no way to take me several hours to even get down there to be able to anoint and lay hands on your daughter personally." But I said, "God is not limited by my inability to be physically present." And I said, "You kneel down there where you are, and I will do the same here where I am, and we'll ask, lay claim on God's promise." Well, with what occurred in the aftermath was one of those striking things that you never forget, because this little child was very instantly healed of her problem, and it was totally healed. And there was no question in terms of, well, was it really bad? Yeah, it was. There was no question of that. And interestingly enough, the mother and about a dozen relatives, because they were all there, they all knew what the situation was, they knew what the prognosis was, they saw what took place, and they were greatly impressed. They had been highly antagonistic toward the church. They all showed up. There's about 15 of them showed up the next Sabbath. Boy, they were all there, they were greatly impressed with the power of God for about 3 or 4 days. They showed up for one Sabbath. They were greatly impressed. And by the end of the week, well, they weren't impressed anymore. Their minds were on other things, and that was sort of the end of things. But I think this occurred on a Friday, so they were still impressed by Saturday. But this was like Friday afternoon. I think Saturday morning they were still impressed, so they showed up for church. But that was about as far as it went. By Sunday or Monday they were thinking about other things. And it taught me a lesson that no matter how dramatic or how impressive a miracle works, sometimes people think, well, if I could see a miracle, I would never doubt. I'd never have any problems with faith after then. Oh, don't kid yourself. Israel did. They saw a miracle that was so impressive. How could you have a more dramatic miracle than opening up the Red Sea? I don't know how many of you ever saw the movie The Ten Commandments. Probably most of you. It's impressive to watch it on the movie. And if you think it was impressive on the movie, just imagine being there. It was impressive, but you come on down to Exodus 15, and here's the song of Moses, and it's the victory song on the last holy day of unleavened bread, and they're going on through the victory song, and this is then Miriam in verse 20 leads the women in the song. And so, verse 22 of chapter 15, Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. 3 days. That's about how long these people in South Texas lasted. Saturday, Sunday, Monday. They went 3 days and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. So they went 3 days looking for water, finally found water, and then when they found it, there was something wrong with it. It was undrinkable. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What are we going to drink?" And he cried unto the Eternal, and God performed a miracle here. And he healed the waters. And so they came on, verse 27, a little further, and they camped here by some areas. And then they came on down a little further. In chapter 16, they came on out a little further, finally left this oasis, and we find that they came... after they got a little further in the wilderness, verse 2, the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron in the wilderness. And they said unto them, "We wish we just died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots. We ate bread to the full. You brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. We're just going to starve to death." And God said, told Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people will go out and gather at a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they'll walk in my law or not." Now, here they were, see a miracle. That's great. They were happy about the miracle. They'd go a little further, and problems would come along. They would encounter another difficulty, encounter something they did not expect. And their faith went out the window. And here they were. They were plagued with negativism. They were hungry, so they immediately jumped to the conclusion they were going to starve to death. I'm hungry, my stomach's growling. I'll never eat again. I'm going to starve to death. I'm going to die here in the desert. I wish I died in Egypt with my belly full. And that's a pretty good jump of a conclusion. You think about it, a fellow gets hungry one day and decides that because he's hungry today, that means he's going to starve to death. And it's amazing. It does take a little time. A person usually doesn't go from, doesn't starve to death because he skipped lunch. He went from breakfast to supper and wasn't any lunch, didn't have anything to eat at noon. So that proved, just going to die. Going to die. It's amazing. A person can get by for days without food. Now, we're not comfortable getting by for days without food, but it takes a pretty good while to starve to death. And God had done all these other things. Did all of this come to mind? No. They were hungry, and they didn't see where the food was going to come from, and they immediately jumped to the conclusion, well, miracles are all over with. God has forgotten about us. We're going to die. If I'm going to die, I wish I'd died back there. I wish I'd died full. I don't want to die hungry. And here they were, all worried about dying. And none of them had died yet. Do we ever do that? We ever just sort of get, things don't go our way? An unexpected problem. You see, they weren't expecting this. They were going to get on a superhighway and just sort of cruise right on down to the promised land. Well, no, they didn't have superhighways, but they were expecting to have a little easier journey than what they had. They had come out of Egypt. They'd come out of all the problems, the adversities, the difficulties. God had delivered them. Great miracle. Problems solved, right? Brethren, as long as we live in the flesh, we never come to the point where all our problems are solved. When your problems are solved, that just means that problem is solved. There's another one that's in front of you. You just haven't gotten there yet. I don't say that to be negative. I just say because that's humanity. That's living life in the flesh. As long as we're physical human beings, we're going to encounter difficulties. We don't know what all of them are. You don't know what's around every twist and turn, and neither do I. They started out, God had called them, they had the opportunity, they were excited, they were filled with zeal, and they encountered difficulties they did not expect. Encountered difficulties they did not expect, and here they became very, very negative, and they were defeated in their own mind. Now, in chapter 16 and verse 35, we're told, the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years. Now imagine that. Here was a miracle performed 6 days a week. 40 years. 40 years. You realize when they came in the promised land, there were people 40 years old that had never known where food came from other than that you went out and, it rained down from heaven. I mean, here were grown men and women. And the only place they'd ever gotten food was, go out in the morning, pick it up. It rains from heaven. Where does food come from? Well, it rains from heaven. Never planted a garden, never plowed a crop. They just went out every morning and picked it up. And it only rains from heaven 6 days a week. It doesn't rain on the seventh day. So you never had a question as to which day the Sabbath was. Though we find that when you go through the story, there were people that went out and looked on Saturday. Just in case. God may have, how do I know? God said it's going to rain 6 days, not going to be any tomorrow. So sure enough, there's some that go out there tomorrow and say, well, I think I like mine fresh. I don't like this day-old stuff. I'm going to go out and get me some fresh. And here they got out there and they couldn't figure out, You imagine the scientists trying to figure out why, trying to give some explanation for that. Well, we come on down in chapter 17, verse 1. They journeyed from the wilderness of sin after their journeys, and they pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. And the people did chide with Moses, and they said, give us water that we may drink. And verse 3, the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses, and they said, this is why you brought us out of the land of Egypt, to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst. Now, here they were thirsty. Wasn't anything there to drink that they expected. Now, understand, here God's been raining food from heaven. They've been miraculously given water at various times in the past. They've been delivered. They've gone through all these things. Now they encounter a problem. You see, the tendency is when we get over the hump, we think, boy, this is solved. Everything's going to be smooth sailing. Everything is great. Now I've finally gotten past this trial. I can relax and, just sort of cruise on in. And they came up against something they didn't expect. Here they were thirsty again. That had happened before and God had delivered them, but they didn't expect it to happen again. And so they were upset and they said, we're just going to die. We knew we were going to die. We told you to leave us alone. We were going to die. Going to die. Well, I'm not going to go on through the accounts of Exodus and Numbers and all of the negativism that beset Israel through their years in the wilderness. But you see, this is one of the things that they quickly lost sight of what God had done in the past. Their focus and their vision was on the problem of the moment. You see, there were a couple of things that set them up for the discouragement and the depression that came in. One is every time a problem was passed, they unrealistically assumed they would not have any problems again. And so they set themselves up for a fall. Well, that's great. We're past the problems. No more problems. Everything's going to be great. As long as we're in the flesh, we're going to encounter problems. We're going to encounter difficulties. So they were unrealistic in their expectations. And so that set them up for just abysmal disappointment. Every time they came to another difficulty, they were just devastated because they unrealistically assumed there wouldn't be any more such difficulties. So they were unrealistic in their expectations, and they were very forgetful and of very short memory when it came to God's power and God's intervention. So they set themselves up to just be on this roller coaster up and down through life, and to be very, very discouraged and depressed. They were unrealistic in terms of what they expected, and they were of very short memory when it came to thinking about what God had done in the past. You see, when we come up on difficulties we don't expect, it can really be devastating sometimes. There's the account told in the book of Joshua. You remember the story of the Siege of Jericho, and we go through that many times during the days of unleavened bread, because that's, of course, when it occurred. And as we come on down, we find in Joshua chapter 6 the story of Jericho and the siege of Jericho and the fall of Jericho, God's miraculous deliverance of this great fortress of the Canaanites into the hands of Israel. And God worked a tremendous miracle. The walls fell down. Now, as we come on down here into chapter 7, verse 2, Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is beside Bethaven on the east side of Bethel, and spoke unto them and said, Go up and view the country. And the men went up and viewed Ai. They returned to Joshua and they said, Look, we don't need a big group to go up here. This Ai is just a little spot out here, a little village. We'll take a couple of thousand men, 2,000 or 3,000 men. We'll go up and we'll just smite Ai. Boy, we'll put a stop to that. It don't make all the people labor there. Well, they're but a few. They're just a little handful. It's just a little village. It doesn't amount to much. We'll take a couple of thousand men. We'll go up and take care of it. Now, they were feeling pretty confident, pretty cocky by this time. All they had to do was come in, march around Jericho 7 days, and the walls came tumbling down. So they were, we're a big, strong army. We go in. We're going to take this place. We'll just roll through here like a hot knife through butter. Boy, we'll have all these Canaanites cleaned out here in a few days. We'll just move in. We'll take over. We'll settle down. They had it all figured out. They knew what they were going to do. Now, Joshua, give us a couple of thousand men. I'll go up here and I'll take care of Ai. Clean that out. I'll be back here for supper. Well, they went up there, verse 4, about 3,000 men, and they fled before the men of Ai. The men of Ai smote of them about 36 men, and they chased them from before the gate, and they smote them, all the way back, and the hearts of the people melted and became as water. From being so cocky and so confident, and all we need is a handful of people. We'll just go up here. We'll take care of it. All of a sudden, the people in Ai came out. The walls didn't come tumbling down when they walked up there. And the men came out and they fought. And there were 36 of them that were killed. And, they were devastated. They came running, hightailing it back. And it says the heart of the people melted and became as water. All their courage was gone. See, they had it all figured out. They just knew. They thought They thought this was faith, but a lot of it was sort of a cocky self-confidence. They thought they had it taken care of, and they're just going to go on and they would do it, and it'd all be done. And they ran into a very unexpected defeat. And all their courage drained away. And they were just devastated. Now Joshua took a positive step. He went and he prayed, and Joshua's approach was one of self-examination. Why? Why is this the case? That's something. Is there something we have done? Is there something wrong? See, that's a good starting point, and Joshua began to really seek God in that way, and God revealed to him, yes, there was. You remember the story. Achan had stolen of the accursed thing, had taken some of exactly what God had told them not to take of there in Jericho. So, this being the case, God had removed his blessing. And the people were, once the sin was removed from their midst, once they had purged out the problem, then God delivered Ai, and they went on forward. And God did work in the future great miracles. But you see, a very important, unexpected defeats can really be devastating. When you've got your hopes up and you just know everything is, you've got it all figured out, and then a problem comes in, something you didn't expect. It can be catastrophic. One of the things that's very important in that circumstance is to step back and begin to examine yourself. Is there a problem? Is there a reason? Now, be careful with that. Let's go back to the book of Job. There is a balancing factor here. Sometimes people can spend their time examining one another. They see somebody who has a problem and they say, obviously, he's got problems. I don't know what he did to be under such a curse, but it must have been awfully bad. Now, this was what Job ran into. You remember the story of Job. And we find, you remember that Satan was allowed by God to begin to afflict Job. Satan, we're told in Job chapter 1 that Job was the greatest man in the land of the east. He was an upright man, one that really feared God, one that hated evil. He was a very wealthy man. And in verse 6 of chapter 1, the book of Job, we find that there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Eternal, and Satan came also among them. And God said, what are you doing here? That ought to teach us something, by the way, that when the sons of God come to present themselves before us, we should not be shocked that the devil comes among them. That's not without precedent. Satan always likes to be where God's people are. Here, of course, the context was the angels. Satan came here among them, and God said, what are you doing here? And he said, I've been going up and down walking up and down in the earth. And God said, have you ever noticed my servant Job? Knowing, of course, that Satan had. And Satan said, well, God says, you ever noticed him? Have you ever seen a man like that? A man that just so completely, so perfectly obeys me? A man that is so wholehearted? And the devil said, well, I guess he does. You pay him pretty well. You set a hedge about him. You don't let anything happen to him. Everything goes smoothly for him. I guess he does. But you let him start having problems, and you'll find he'll curse you to your face. Why, Job doesn't really love you. He's not really, his obedience and his service to you is not based on love and devotion. It's because you pay him well. You make it convenient for him. The results he gets for his obedience are very real and tangible right here, right now. And so anyway, you know the story. God allowed the devil first to take Job's prosperity away, and finally to afflict his person. And we find that Job, in Job 2 and verse 10, that in all this did not Job sin with his lips. He never did what the devil expected him to do. He did not curse God to his face. Now, we find that Job had some friends that came together. Job had some friends. And as you read a little bit about Job's friends, you realize that with friends like this, Job didn't need any enemies to come. His friends showed up. And sometimes our friends can mean well. And Job's friends evidently meant well. But, they sat there and they were sympathetic and they listened for a while and they looked and just were appalled at the horrible state that Job was in. And you see in Job chapter 2 and verse 11, Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, and they came from their own place, and they agreed to come together here. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And they made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. So they were going to encourage him. They were going to go visit their friend. They had heard, time had gone by, word had traveled, and so they came on down here. And in chapter 4, Eliphaz decided that he was going to speak to him. And notice what Eliphaz said to him. Verse 7, he says, "Now I ask you a question, Job." He says, "Remember, whoever perished being innocent? Or where were the righteous cut off? You know what I've always seen," he said in verse 8, "they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same." Oh boy, this is encouragement. He said, "Job, I've seen something in life. You know what I've seen? People always get what they have coming." Now here's old Job sitting there, just miserable and achy and sore and the pus oozing from sores and all his property is destroyed and his family has been wiped out, and here he is sitting here being miserable, and he's got one of his friends say, "Job, I'd like to talk to you a little while. You know something I've observed in life? People get what they have coming." Well, if you were feeling bad before, you really were feeling, how would you like that? And so Eliphaz went on and he gave him the benefit of his advice. I've always noticed, people, if you sow wickedness, boy, you're going to reap it. You reap what you sow, Job. And he began to really lay it on thick and told him in verse 17 of chapter 5, he says, "Happy is the man whom God corrects." You just need to fess up, Job, because God's really dealing with you and you're reaping what you've sown. Now, what did you do? Must have been awfully bad to have all this. Well, you can go on through the story. We come on over here to chapter 8. And Bildad the Shuhite, it was his turn to speak. And he said, look, he says, now you've been talking to God and crying out to God. In verse 6 here of chapter 8, he says, "If you were pure and upright, surely now he would await for you and make the habitation of your righteousness prosperous." He said, now, one thing about it, he says, if you really, because Job had finished sort of defending himself, see, after Eliphaz, and Bildad said, now look, Job, if you really were pure and righteous, don't you think God would listen? I mean, hey, look at you. Isn't this a pretty good indication that you're not really what you tell us you are? Because I don't see God intervening and delivering you, and if you were really pure and righteous, God would be intervening. God would be taking care of this problem. Looks like to me that you got problems, Job. Well, we come on down here in chapter 10 and we see that Job is becoming more and more depressed. I mean, chapter 10 verse 1, Job says, "My soul is weary of my life. I'll leave my complaint upon myself. I'll speak in the bitterness of my soul." He was just really beginning to feel depressed and discouraged, and he just didn't know why this thing was hanging on. And his friends just made it worse. Because they kept saying, well, now, look, obviously you have really done something bad to have these problems. Well, in chapter 11, Zophar answered. And he had a good point to make down in verse 6 of chapter 11. In verse 5, he tells Job, he says, "Oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you. I wish God would talk to you, Job, and that he would show you the secrets of wisdom, that they are double to that which is. Know therefore that God exacts of you less than your iniquity deserves. He said, Job, I think you're getting by lightly. Here is Job. He's sitting there in the ash pile. The sore is just oozing out, and he's miserable, lost everything. His friend says, I think you're getting off pretty lightly. God's merciful, and He hasn't exacted of you what you deserve. You deserve worse than this. And Job's sitting here thinking, I don't think there could be worse than this. So here are his friends. They've come to encourage him. Now, you and I have never done that when we went to encourage anybody, have we? You ever gone see somebody who was depressed? Let me ask it this way. See, you may think you never have, but let me ask this. Have you ever been depressed, had somebody come to see you, and by the time they left, you were feeling worse? You thought you were discouraged and down before they came. By the time they left, you were really feeling down. A little more encouragement like that, and you'd just about been finished off. You see, Job's friends didn't think that they were there to help him. They thought they were there to help him. Well, you could go on through. Job was very depressed and dealing with a very difficult situation. In fact, he told them in Job 16, verse 1, Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Boy, you miserable comforters. You guys haven't helped one bit. So Job was really telling it to them. But there was one thing that Job was discouraged. Job may have been bogged down in self-pity and a lot of different things. It's easy to point fingers at Job when we're feeling comfortable and we're not going through the misery that Job was. But there was one thing about Job that's brought out right here. Notice at the very depths of his misery what Job said. This is something, and this is an important key. Job never lost sight of this fact. Job 19:25. He says, For I know that my Redeemer liveth. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that He shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And after I shall awake, though the body be destroyed, yet out of my flesh shall I see God. I'm reading verse 26 from the marginal translation, the literal Hebrew, which makes it, I think, a little clearer than the King James. After I awake, though this flesh be destroyed, yet out of my flesh shall I see God. I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that there is a God. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that His feet shall stand upon this earth in the latter days. And though I am destroyed, and though I rot and decay, and my body becomes food for worms, I know that the time will come when I will awaken, I will live, and I will see my Redeemer. Job never lost sight, even in the depths, of the fact that there is a real God. There is a real God. And that there is ultimately coming a solution. Though right now we may be at the depths and not see how these things are going to come about between now and then, and may not understand why we're going through what we're going. See, Job didn't understand why. He was discouraged, he was in pain, he was miserable. But he knew that God had a plan. And he knew God was going to accomplish that plan. And that was important not to lose sight of. On down in chapter 21, in verse 13, Job made this comment. He says, they spend their days in wealth, and in a moment go down to the grave. Verse 26, they shall lie down alike in the dust, and the worm shall cover them. Behold, I know your thoughts and the devices which you wrongfully imagine against me. For you say, where is the house of the prince? And where are the dwelling places of the wicked? Have you not asked them that go by, and do you not know their tokens? That the wicked is reserved to the day of destruction, and shall be brought forth to the day of wrath. Job told his friends, he said, look, guys, don't you realize that ultimate justice is not accomplished here and now on this earth? Don't you realize there are wicked who are living in prosperity? And don't you realize there are righteous who are suffering? Do you think that everybody who's wealthy is wealthy because they're righteous? That's what he was telling his friends. Do you think that everybody who is afflicted and has a problem is that way because they're a worse sinner than someone else? He said, don't lose sight of this. Everybody is going down alike into the dust. And their flesh is going to decay and going to become food for worms, regardless of how much wealth they may have had and how much power and regardless of any of these things. But he says, understand this, the wicked is reserved unto the day of destruction. They'll be brought forth to the day of wrath. There is a time of reckoning coming. They may die in the midst of prosperity and power. You know, every wicked prince and every wicked ruler has not always died a horrible death. Some have died relatively peacefully in bed in old age. They've all died. You know, righteous people have died. Ungodly people have died. They've all died. So Job is looking on beyond. He understood two things. See, he understood God has a plan, that his Redeemer lives, and God has a purpose that he is working out. He never lost sight of that, and he didn't lose sight of the fact that ultimately justice will not be accomplished until Christ returns. So everything is not going to be leveled out in that way until that time. We must never lose sight of that. Job didn't. Now, we're told in Job chapter 32, there were things for Job to learn. The friends missed the whole point. Job did serve God out of love and devotion. He was loyal to God, and he did trust God and understand God's plan. There were things about himself that he didn't see. We're told in chapter 32 and verse 1 that he was righteous in his own eyes, and that he justified himself rather than God. He became so fixed on the fact that he didn't deserve this. And you go through the story here and you see Elihu, the fourth individual who has not previously figured in the story, now goes through and begins to explain some things to Job. And ultimately in Job chapter 42, Job comes to a deeper, fuller awareness of God. He answers that we can still rise up and see him. And that no matter how comfortably a wicked man died, ultimately there is an accountability to God. Now, you know, things don't always work out the way we hope. Sometimes people have their schedule, their scenario in mind. You remember the story of Jonah. Remember, Jonah did not want to go down and preach to Nineveh. The obvious reason was Jonah did not want to see. He didn't want to take a chance on Nineveh repenting. He wanted Nineveh to get destroyed. He didn't like Ninevites. See? That's very plain here as you go through the story of Jonah. We're told in Jonah chapter 3 and verse 10, when God saw their works, that they turned from their evil, he repented of the evil that he would do. In verse 4, or chapter 4, verse 1 of Jonah, it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry. Jonah was mad because he wanted to see Nineveh get it. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and he didn't like Assyrians. There was a real antagonism between Assyria and Israel. And Assyria was continually threatening Israel. And Jonah was relieved when he found out that Assyria was going to be destroyed. And God convinced Jonah that he really did need to go to Nineveh. You know, God has ways of sometimes persuading us if we don't want to do something. You remember the story of the great fish, and by the time that Jonah got spit out on the banks there, he was ready to preach wherever God told him to preach. But he was displeased. He was unhappy because his plans didn't work out. Things didn't go the way he had in mind. And so, he was depressed. Chapter 4, verse 3, just wanted to die. He says, better than I just not live. And God said, well, what are you so upset about? You think you do well to be angry? Well, Jonah went out of the city and he sat on the east side of the city, chapter 4 here in verse 5. And he made a little hut, you know, built a little booth, a little lean-to sit under, to get a little shade. He was going to sit there and watch, you know, and hope that maybe they didn't keep repenting and God would zap them. He was going to, that he might see what would become of the city. Well, God prepared a gourd, and he made the gourd to come up over Jonah, that it might be a shadow over his head. And Jonah was glad of the gourd. Now, here was, you know, this gourd vine just grew up, and boy, it was a big, lush foliage that came out, and here was some shade for old Jonah. This is a lot better than this little lean-to out of sticks that he built, and it sort of made things a little cooler, and Jonah was enjoying that. But then God prepared a worm the next morning, and the worm smote the gourd that it withered. Verse 7. And the sun did rise, and a strong, hot east wind blowing off the desert came, and the sun beat on his head, and Jonah was about to faint, and he was ready to die again. Verse 8. Boy, he was really depressed now. God had killed his gourd. Verse 9, God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the gourd? And he says, I do well to be angry even unto death. Yeah, I'm mad. I just wish I could die. You kill my gourd. And God said, look, he says, you had pity on the gourd. You felt sorry about that gourd. You liked that gourd, and it was a nice gourd, and you felt sorry about it. Now, what did you have to do with that gourd? You didn't plant it. You didn't plow for it. You didn't labor. You had nothing to do with making it grow. It grew up in a night, and it was gone. He said, you had pity on the gourd. Don't you think I ought to have as much pity on all these people down here that I made in my image? Can't I have as much pity on the people as you had on the gourd? You know, Jonah was depressed because things didn't work out the way he wanted. You know, we all have things in mind in terms of the way we'd like to see things work out. We have to learn in life, though, that we're not the script writer. God doesn't read the lines that we write for him. You know, we can't be the script writer, the director, the producer. We write the lines and God reads them. Life doesn't work that way. Jonah was depressed because God didn't do it the way he wanted it done. Things didn't happen exactly the way he had in mind. Now, there's some real keys that I want to focus on here in terms of handling the discouragement and depression. We've looked at some of them. Let's look here. Let's sort of put it together. Let's go back to Psalm 73. Let's look at three things. Psalm 73, verse 1, truly God is good to Israel, even to such as are of a clean heart. But as for me, my feet were almost gone, my steps had well nigh slipped. For I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. There were no bands in their death, their strength is firm. They're not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. Pride compasses them as a chain, and violence covers them as a garment. Their eyes stand out with fatness, and they have more than the heart could wish. They're corrupt and speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily. Now, the psalmist says here, you know, I began to look at what people were getting by with, and I was envious. I said, that's not right. That's not fair. He lost sight as he looked around and looked at the problems and difficulties he was having and looked at people who seemingly were getting by with it. They seemed to be getting by with it. You ever look at sometimes somebody and say, why is it, verse 5, why is it doesn't look like they're in trouble like other people? Doesn't look like they don't seem to have any problems, and they're not even trying to obey God. You ever said that? You ever looked at somebody, and just, why is it he's getting by with that? Why, if I did that, the ground would probably open up and swallow me. This guy's getting by with it. He's a crook, and nobody's doing anything. Well, this really bothered him. You know what bothers some people? And it eats on them. They become bitter. They become embittered and depressed and discouraged and just frustrated and angry at life. Well, the solution to that is coming on down here. Verse 16, when I thought to know this, it was too painful for me. It upset me, it grieved me, I was depressed, I was frustrated, I was angry. Verse 17, until I went into the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their end. You did set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. So then he began to repent. And verse 22 says, I was foolish and ignorant. You see, when I began to think and meditate in God's sanctuary, I understood their end. I realized that there is a real God who is going to accomplish His results. That we don't put it over on God. You see, that's one of the first steps, is coming to really see God. That God has a plan and a purpose, and that ultimately all of us have to stand before God. So, real justice will ultimately only come from God. Why should we expect to see real justice and real fairness in the midst of the devil's world? So, that's one of the first steps to handling the things that get us discouraged and depressed and frustrated, is to come to see God. Job did that. I know that my Redeemer lives. The psalmist here came to see. Yes, there is a result. No matter what anybody seems to be getting by with here and now, there is an accountability to God. There is a reward to the righteous, and there is a punishment to the wicked. No matter what you and I may see right here, right now, there is a real God, and there are results that He's going to bring about. Second thing, let's notice the example of Jesus Christ. Matthew 26. Here's the example of Jesus Christ on His final Passover. In Matthew 26 and verse 38, He had gone out after the Passover into the Garden of Gethsemane. This is prior to His arrest. And He said here to Peter and James and John, in verse 38 of Matthew 26, He said unto them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry you here and watch with me. So here He was, really at the low point of His life. He said, I am deeply grieved. I'm depressed. He went a little further, and He fell on His face, and He prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. I don't want to have to go through with what lies ahead in the hours immediately ahead. If there's any other way, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Brethren, we go through and read this. Was Jesus Christ just play acting? Jesus Christ had emptied Himself and become a human being. He was flesh and blood. He had pre-existed with the Father from all eternity, but he had become a human being. He had emptied himself and took upon himself the nature of the seed of Abraham. And he was crying out to the Father in heaven. And he said, "Not my will, but your will." He came and he found the disciples asleep. Here they were. He had asked them to pray with him, and they had sacked out. They were tired and didn't really fully understand what was going on. Did not have that same sense of urgency. So in verse 41, he says, "Watch and pray." He says, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And so he went again the second time and he prayed, "O my Father, if this cup may not pass from me except I drink it, your will be done." And so again, verse 44, he went and prayed the third time. Jesus Christ came to the point of absolute, total acceptance of the will of God. It involved something that he did not want to do with every ounce of the flesh, with every fiber of his physical being. He did not want to go through the pain and the degradation that he had to go through over the next few hours. But what was his point? What was his approach? What example did he set? He spent here hours in intense prayer, not for the purpose of trying to rewrite the script for God. He said, "Look, if there's any other way, I don't want to do this." He was honest with God. He didn't deny how he felt. See, that's important in our prayers. It's not a matter of trying to play act to God and try to convince God that we feel differently than we do. He was very honest and open, and he said, "I don't want to do this. If there's any other way, let's do it." But he kept coming back to the fact that, "Help me to accept your will." Acceptance of God's will is one of the greatest keys, learning to put things into God's hands. Notice the result. You know, Jesus Christ started out up here in verse 28, exceeding sorrowful, deeply depressed. In verse 38, probably in a way he had never been in his entire life. But you know, we're told that we don't have a Savior that can't be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. He understands everything you and I go through. He was in all points tempted, like as we are, yet without sin. Paul tells us that in Hebrews. Does Jesus Christ know what it's like to be discouraged and depressed? Deeply depressed? Absolutely. Right here, verse 38. Perhaps the only time in his life that he was, but as he came to this point that evening, he was battling deep depression. But notice, by the time he finished, verse 45, he came to the disciples, woke them up, and said in verse 46, "Rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that does betray me." He was no longer depressed. He was facing the worst ordeal of his life, and he was not depressed. Why? Because he had totally put it in God's hands. He had accepted God's will. When you accept God's will, there is a peace that we have. A turning loose of self-will. A turning loose of trying to write the script. Of recognizing our powerlessness and turning it over and putting it in God's hands, and acceptance of God's will. See, we've got to come to see God, to understand God's power, and to understand that God is ultimately going to accomplish His purpose. Then we've got to turn it over. We've got to put it in God's hands. And the final point, let's notice briefly back in 1 Kings 19. You remember the story of Elijah. Now in 1 Kings chapter 18, we have the story of certainly one of the greatest high points of Elijah's life. That in 1 Kings chapter 18, you remember the story. Elijah confronted the priests of Baal, called down fire from heaven, consumed the sacrifices. The priests of Baal were slaughtered. "How long halt you between two opinions?" God told the people of Israel. One of the greatest high points of Elijah's life. God worked through Elijah powerfully. He came out of this on a real high. And when Jezebel found out what had happened, chapter 19, verse 2, she sent Elijah word and she said, "Buddy, you're dead." You know, sometimes when you come through a great event and you come through and finally you've gotten through it, you don't expect to have to face another trial. Elijah had come through this great high period, and the last thing he thought things at least were going to be quiet for a while. And the next morning, he gets a note and says, "Buddy, you're dead. I'm going to have you killed by evening." Now here was a man of tremendous faith, but boy, this just really sent him for a loop, and I can't believe it. Oh, no. And he took off. He became very depressed. Asked God, just to the point, verse 4, he went into the wilderness, sat down on a juniper tree, and asked God to just let him die. He said, "I just can't keep on through these ups and downs and through all of this stuff. I just want to die and get it over with." And he was depressed. You know, all he wanted to do was sleep and just to die. You know, it's interesting. God did three things here. One, He told him to get up and told him to eat. A lot of times when somebody's depressed, they just lose their appetite, don't want to eat. God said, "Eat." Then He brought him here to Horeb. And God brought Elijah to understand Him more fully. He revealed Himself more clearly to Elijah. And then notice what He told Elijah. God told him in verse 15, after chapter 19, verse 15, He says, "Go your way, go, return on the way to the wilderness of Damascus. And I've got a job for you. I want you to anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and I want Jehu anointed to be king over Israel, and Elisha is going to be anointed as your successor." He gave Elijah a job to do. He set some goals before him. He said, "I want you to get out and get busy. Enough of this moping around. You need to get busy." See, Elijah needed to do several things. He needed some time to himself. He needed to eat. He needed to renew his relationship with God, and he needed to get up and get busy. And see, that's one of the important things in terms of breaking out of depression and discouragement. Yes, we have to come to see God. Faith. We have to come to a point of acceptance, of turning things over to God. And we need to get up and get busy. We need to get about doing what it is we need to do. Even when we don't feel like it, because you start doing, and that in itself is positive. And when you have put it in that order, when you come to a point of really deepening and renewing your relationship with God, getting things in perspective, seeing God and God's plan, realizing that God is working out a plan and a purpose, and that it will culminate with Christ's return and God's kingdom. When you really come to focus on that, and then to turn it over to God and to accept God's will, and to turn loose of self-will, then it's time to get busy and to go forward and to concentrate on doing what we need to do. We're encountering problems and difficulties and adversities. We're encountering them here before the Passover, and brethren, we will continue to encounter them as long as we journey through the Christian life. That's life. But we are not called to have to do it on our own. There is help, there is hope. And as Job says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the latter day His feet shall stand upon the earth, and regardless of what happens between now and then, I shall see Him." We will see Him as He is, for we will be like Him. Let's never, ever lose sight of that fact.